Homesteader of the Rockies, and welcome to the Susie Homesteader channel. And today we're going to talk about part 2 of our remodel of a porch to a dining room. And in part 1, hopefully you got to see that last video, and we talked about heating and cooling your remodel or the room that you're remodeling. We talked about insulation and ventilation, and we talked a little bit about framing, getting your framing started before you take all those other things into consideration. So today we're going to go to part 2, and we're going to kind of pick up where I left off, and that's going to be wiring, walls, and windows, which is the next phase that I just finished. So some of this, like I said, is kind of closed up, but I will have some images for you in this as we go of some steps that I went through before I had to close up my walls or put in my windows, for example. So one of the most important things you have to consider on your remodel is your wiring, and that is because a lot of your other phases can't get completed until you get your wiring done. So in my case, which I talked about a little bit in part 1, a lot of my wiring, I wound up in this particular remodel having to go underneath my porch, underneath the floor. And I only have one board pulled up at the time, but what I'm going to show you is some of the, this is a metal clad wire that is run underneath my porch, which I chose to use, and it's also just kind of held up onto these floor joists with some zip ties that I kind of had to double up. But this is an example, basically, of some wiring that I chose to go with, which is not Romex, but it's a metal-clad wire, which basically means the wire is just set inside like a metal sheathing. And an example of some wiring that you may have that's not put in something like that, that's also kind of heavy-duty, would be something like a direct burial cable or a direct burial wire. Now, this is my well pump wire, which technically is buried directly into the ground, which is why they call it direct burial. But as you can see, where it starts to come out of the ground, it's not buried. And it's not buried underneath my porch, which it should have been, all the way up to where it goes to the actual wall, in the hole in the wall, into the house. So what happened with that, and here's an example of a problem with not having some of your wires encased into another material, even in the event that it is direct burial, is that where it goes into the house to my pressure tank, there was a mouse that actually tried to get in that hole and shoot up my well wire one year and destroyed my well wire. And of course not where it was buried, but where that well wire was not buried. So, you know, you have to kind of consider where some of your wiring is going to end up at some point. And in my case, because I'm in the Rockies, of course I do have to worry about mice and rodents and pack rats chewing on things, and especially shiny things. So I did choose to go with the metal clad wiring, which is a little bit more expensive, but way more durable on just my outlets and my heaters and my lights in this particular remodel, because a lot of this wiring is being run underneath my porch and then eventually up into the walls. So what happens after we get, like I said, in my case, a lot of this wiring run under the porch, you know, it'll eventually come out behind the wall. So for example, this is a wall heater, and it is on an exterior wall, which a lot of people will tell you not to do because you're not going to get as much heat. But if your, say, your flush mount heater or your cadet heater, as they're also called, is set inside your wall and it has a can like this that it's encased in, you can insulate behind it with whatever kind of insulation you're using. So again, a lot of people will tell you not to put these heaters on exterior walls because it kind of defeats the purpose. But like I said, as long as it has an encasement like that, you can insulate behind it and you're good to go. So again, my metal clad wiring is brought up all the way into these walls from below the floor. the porch. And again, it's still not even really sitting on the ground itself because it is attached to the floor joists to keep it off the ground. So it's brought into this wall, and then the same will be done with your outlets. You know, it'll be brought in behind your actual framing. Now, in my case, because I'm doing a siding on the interior of this Four Seasons porch, similar to exactly what I'm doing on the outside, exterior siding of this exact same room, I am putting up an OSB, which if this was a regular interior wall, it would probably be drywall or sheetrock. So you wouldn't need to put OSB on here. But in my case, I chose to just because I'm actually laying a siding on top of this OSB. So when you have your electrician come in, something you have to discuss with him, or if you're doing your electric by yourself, is how far out you need your outlets or any of these pieces placed. Because, for example, by the time that's set back into the framing or screwed to the actual frame inside, you know, I needed almost 1.5 inches set out because I had 1/2 inch OSB, and then I'm also going to have 3/4 inch siding on top of that. So as you can see, that could have been brought out even farther actually. When you have your electrician come in, make sure he knows what your finished wall is going to be, because he's going to set those outlets and those heaters and even the light switches or the light fixtures out. He's going to set those out a certain distance. So you do kind of want to know, like I said, where you're going to end up on these walls when you're discussing that with your electrician in terms of where everything needs to actually be placed. So, and then in my case, I did actually also run some wiring up through my ceiling as well, because I already had some wiring up here from the can lights that were already existing. So I was able to cut some holes into the soffit and kind of relocate some wires that were already up there to connect to. So something to think about now, if you have wiring up in a ceiling or, again, down in your walls, and you're going to be nailing up into that, you need some kind of a nail plate on there, or just mark it somehow so that you know when you're, whether you're using staples or your nail gun nails, make sure you have some nail plates put in directly in front of where that wiring is, even with the metal wiring, even with the metal clad wiring, because you can actually still get a nail through that metal as well. So make sure you're using nail plates as well, even if you have the metal clad wiring. And again, be careful when you're doing stuff in the ceilings or any other place that you might be nailing paneling or TNG or any other kind of a you know, material too. So kind of a lot of things to think about in terms of your wiring, whether you're going to run it, like I said, through the floor or through some of the ceilings, and then of course you're eventually going to wind up in the walls at some point for all your switches and your outlets. So there's a couple ideas for you on wiring. And then secondly, after you get all your wiring put in, then you can go ahead and insulate behind your wiring, which you won't see right now, but I'll show you within an image here. And then after you insulate, you're going to put on your finished wall, or in my case it was some OSB board, some sheathing. So a few steps that you have to wait for, like as I said, until you know where all your wiring is going to be. And then on your boards, of course, you're going to have to cut out any kind of openings that you have prior to placing these boards on. So here's a good example of a cutout for an outlet. And we also had to cut out for the heater that's going to go in here. So you're going to make all your cutouts. You can use a jigsaw, which works really nice on those squares. And then you can also use a hole saw if you want to for round light fixtures or anything up high that's a circle. So lots of ways to cut out your appliance or your electrical appliances that you have behind this wall. So that's the only other thing that you need to do before you put up your actual boards or even your drywall. And then some people, depending on what kind of insulation you use, if you use an insulation that has bats or facing on it already, which is kind of like a paper, you don't necessarily need to put in a visqueen over your insulation. And some people don't use visqueen at all. So in my case, I just used a paper bat for my papered face, I'm sorry, for my insulation bats. And so therefore I did not visqueen over that. And then some places where I didn't have the face insulation, I did do a clear visqueen, which you can kind of tell how that was kind of covering the light fixture before I put up that OSB. And then obviously we'll just cut that out when we put in the light fixture itself. So visqueen, some people do visqueen before they put up their final walls, some people don't. It really just kind of depends on, I think, how much, what kind of a climate you're living in and how much moisture you have in that climate. So there's something else you want to consider on materials for your walls. And so you got your wiring in and you got your walls up. So your next step you might want to start on is going to be your windows. So let's go over here to a window. And a window has to be set in from the outside as opposed to the inside. So in my case, these windows I had to have custom made just because they're almost 8 and 9 foot, well, actually they're more than 8 feet and some almost 10 feet long. And so there's a lot of weight to this window. So this is definitely a 2-person job on a window this big. These are big, these are heavy. You are able to take out any of the sliding window pieces if you have to, just to make it a little bit lighter. But as I said, a window this big is a 2-person job, so you might want to think about that when you're putting in your windows. So hopefully when you're getting your windows in, you've already got your rough opening ready for your window. And a couple things you're going to have before you put in your windows is some caulking, some kind of a waterproof window and door caulking, which I think DAP makes, or silicone, which they make exactly for windows and doors. And you want to get some shims for the inside of the window to kind of keep your window level, and you're absolutely going to need a level, and you're going to need some screws and a putty knife. So anyway, let's just say you got some help to get your windows in. There's 2 ways to get that started. You can put your caulking on the actual fin, on the inside of this fin of the window, or you can set your caulking on, for example, like the tar paper, all the way around the window. I like to put it directly on the wall itself, the exterior wall, instead of the window, because it does get really messy, especially in a window this big when you're trying to lift that up, you know, and then place it. So you want to, on the inside of this window, you want to make sure you have your shims kind of set on the sill, so that hopefully your windowsill, if you've left yourself enough room, is not sitting directly on the sill, which is okay to do if you have to, but you're kind of better off having a little gap underneath the window itself, so that when it's sitting on a shim that you're going to take out, when it all gets screwed in the event that anything starts to shift or move over time, it doesn't put any pressure on the window at all, because hopefully you have at least a 1/4 of an inch gap on the inside rough opening all the way around of your window. So it's nice to put some shims kind of down on the sill on the inside before you set this window down. And of course you're going to take those out after you get it all leveled. So you've got your silicone or your waterproof caulking on the wall, and then you're going to, as I said, get your shims on the sill, set your window in. Hopefully you're all on target so you don't have to take it back out. It's nice to have somebody on the inside there to kind of tell you which direction to go, left or right, or up and down. And then, of course, somebody getting your screws in, not necessarily every single hole, but just enough to kind of secure the window so that you can go back and get your level on the inside and the outside and just kind of see where you're at, making sure that your window is perfectly level. So one way you'll know your window is not level is because your sliders, if you have them on a window, just won't open and close that easily. So one of the best ways to know, even if it does look level, if your window is placed right, is to go on the inside and actually open and close any windows that are openable, and see how easy those slide. So if they're sliding freely, then you're good to go. And then what you want to do is you want to go back with a putty knife before this all dries and try and flatten out this caulking. And then of course make sure that your corners are really nice and flat, because if they're not, or if this caulking dries in big bunches, you're going to have a hard time getting your trim, your final trim on here nice and flat. So it's kind of nice if you can just take a putty knife and make sure all that caulking is as flat as you can get it before it dries. And try not to have screws sticking out too far either. Unfortunately, in this case, I did have to go in sideways because we were a little off on my measurements. So, you know, you really want your screws as flat as possible so that it doesn't hold up the trim or keep the trim sticking out at all when you finally get ready to do your trim and your siding. So there's a couple tips on windows. As you can see, this one came out really nice. It fit like a glove. It's nice and level, and my windows open and close or slide really, really nicely. So that worked out great. And then I had 2 or 3 other windows that I put in that were about this size. So it is a lot easier to do windows when you have smaller windows. So you might want to take that into consideration, especially if you're maybe 2 stories high and you're on some scaffolding and you thought a 10-foot window would look really nice, but you might want to rethink that and go back to maybe a 5 or 4-foot window, any place where you have to put those windows in a really difficult spot. So I did change one window that I had that was almost a 10-foot window into half of that, just because it was going to actually be really heavy and really hard to put in 2 stories high on some scaffolding. So lots to think about. They do weigh a lot more than they look, and especially if you do what I had to do because we're in the Rockies, which is obviously a double paned, but a well insulated and I think they call it lowy window, vinyl window as opposed to aluminum. And anyways, this is just basically one of the best kind of insulated type windows you can buy. So that's what I had to go with just because of our temperatures here. You might not have that issue when you're picking out your windows. And again, you know, it really was not that much more expensive for me to custom order these into the dimensions that I actually had to have versus going down to one of your home improvement stores and buying them there. So you might want to make some phone calls to some of your local glass companies and compare prices because, as I said, mine custom ordered were actually cheaper than they were in some of the local stores. So lots to think about on windows, but as I said, mine came out really nice. Really happy with them. And then the next video I'll do, we'll start talking about placing your doors. And that'll be the next thing that we put in here. And again, in my case, I have to put my doors in before my flooring because I have a very low clearance here and I won't have enough room for a standard door to sit on a subfloor. So I talked about that a little bit in one of my other videos. But again, in my case, I will have to put in my sliding patio doors prior to putting in my flooring. So hopefully you'll see that in my next video where we'll skip from windows to doors, which is really quite a different process than putting in your windows, and hopefully we won't have too many problems with that. So there's a couple new things to start considering with your remodel. So we talked about wiring, finishing out your walls, and getting your windows in. And then, as I said, part 3, we'll start talking about doors and some subflooring. So every phase starts a new batch of materials. And if you have any questions on this one, come and see me on my website, Susie Homesteader of the Rockies, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions you might have. So we'll see you there. Bye-bye.
I broke the window again. Dad's gonna be pissed.
So, let's get started. Subscribe to the Susie Homesteader channel, and we'll see you there. Bye-bye.